Welcome to part 3, and we'll be starting our JavaScript for our rock, paper, scissors. I'm in my index.html file, and we went over our CSS, and our HTML is done for us, but we're going to have to investigate our HTML and look at some things and identify where the ID's at and all those kind of things. But for now, you don't have to worry about that too much, but we are going to have to set up our JavaScript, and there's nothing there, and there's actually going to be a lot of JavaScript. One thing, I'm working in Atom right now. For some reason, the tag shows up with this weird orange, and then the closing bracket is blue, and then this is blue. If I click here, it shows up with underlines, like that's the opening and that's the closing. It looks correctly. But if I click in the middle here, it doesn't. It's just, I don't know why, it's just an odd kind of quirky kind of thing, but it works fine. It's okay. So if you happen to be working in Atom and it looks like that, that's okay. You know, if you click here, you can see the opening and closing. So we're going to start putting some code in between these script tags, and it says JavaScript starts here, JavaScript ends here. So everything of their JavaScript is going to be in here, other than when we put our on-click events inside buttons. So we're going to start here, and the first thing I'm going to do is something new, and this is like a little shortcut thing. And what we're going to do is create I'll just call it kind of a shortcut. And this shortcut is actually called a function expression, because instead of just saying function and giving it a name, we're actually going to create a variable or define a variable that's going to represent the function, and it's basically going to pass a DOM element like an ID. And I'll just kind of type it out so you see what it is. We're going to create a variable, and we're just going to use the $sign, just something very generic, the $sign, and we're going to say equals, and we're going to say function. And that means it's using a function, and its parameter in here, we're just going to say ID. That means it's going to return whatever ID we feed it. What we're going to do next is we're just going to kind of do our curly brackets. And in here, we're going to do a return statement. And the statement we're going to return here, well, the return statement, but what we're going to return is document, and I'll just use these shortcuts here, .get element, and .get element by ID. And I'm just going to put ID in here, and basically it's going to return that, and it's basically going to be a shortcut, so we don't have to type out document.get element by ID. I mean, it's hard enough to say, but then we have to type it all the time. So we're going to make sure that we just kind of use this, and then I'll show you what we can do. Then we could use the $sign and just put the ID name in here, and it'll basically be a shortcut of this. That's what it's going to be. This $sign will represent that. So that variable will kind of represent that, and it'll run that function as a function. It'll kind of just pass along the ID name in there. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. So let me finish this off here with a semicolon, and we're just going to use this when we make our first function. So this is called a function expression, and we're going to use it just to get a DOM element of ID, and then we're going to use it, and it'll make our code a lot easier to type when we're doing some of these things where we're getting elements by ID. So that's what we're going to do next, and what we're going to start with is the one where we actually, I'll show you this one here, is where we put in our name. Let me refresh this. And if we put in a name here, any name, I'll put Steve in here, and if I hit the submit button, it's going to replace that name. So what do I need to know? Well, I need to know what this thing is. This is an input box, so I need the ID of this. I need to know where it's going to go, so I need the ID of that. That's like a paragraph that's above here. So I'm going to have to know some things here, and I could look at my HTML code. It should be fairly easy to find. So we're basically going to get the value that's typed in here, and we're going to display it here and replace where it says human. And if you don't, it'll just keep human in there. So we're going to have to do an if-else statement so that if they don't put anything in there, it'll just leave human in there. So that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to make a little function. So before we do any of this other kind of stuff with the images or any of that, keeping score, displaying random arrays and all that, we're just going to take this name and do that. So we'll kind of warm up here with our first little function. So this will be the submit function, and we'll just call it like submitName. That'll be a good name for our function. So down here, I'm just going to do it after here, and we're going to keep building up inside our script tags. And now this isn't a function expression, this is just a function. So we'll do function, and we'll call it submitName. And we'll use camel case, and we'll put our parentheses there, and then we'll put our curly brackets. And we may have more curly brackets in here because we may have an if-else statement. And what we're going to do first, we're going to need to set a variable that basically represents that input area. of whatever people put in that input area, because we may use it again, and we may do that outside of the function so that it's global, so we could use it in other functions and in other places rather than putting it in here. So I'm actually going to do that right before here, and I'm just going to create a var, and what that's going to represent, I'll just say var, and the name of that var, it's not going to be $, the name of that var, let's see where we're getting it from. It's basically this div ID enter name, and it's your name, and let's just call it your name because that's what it's going to be. There's an ID called your name, there's a name called your name, so we're just going to call it, we could call the var the same thing, we'll just call it your name. So we're going to say var your name, and to start we're going to have nothing in there. So we could do two things. We could just do this and just put a semicolon and not really assign it any kind of value. That would just be initializing it. Or we can also kind of assign it a value, and we could just give it nothing to start. So we could do that too. So that would be assigning that variable your name nothing. Now we're gonna use that again in here, but we're just declaring it here. We're declaring that variable your name. So remember, the variable's different than we have IDs and names and stuff that's up here. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this input area that has an ID of your name. So what we'll do first is we're going to get that value that's in there. Okay, now what are we going to do with that value? And we're actually, since we have this declared, we're actually going to pass it through a variable. So that's why we're making a variable, so then we can, whenever we have your name in there, whatever people put in, we could kind of pass that data along. We'll store it as a variable. So we're going to say your name, and your name is basically going to be assigned to whatever someone fills in there. Now initially it's set to nothing, but now when someone fills something in there, that's actually going to be what we're going to use. So to get that, we're going to say your name equals, and here's where we could do the first shortcut. We're going to say $, and then in parentheses we're just going to put in the ID. Now what ID do we want to get your name from? We have to go up here and look for the input, and it's the ID your name. That's the ID that it's going to go into, so whatever anybody puts in there. So we're going to use the ID your name, and then we're going to get the value from that too. So we're going to go back down here, and in quotes we're going to put in your name and hopefully spell it right. So we're going to be getting that, and it's going to be, the ID is going to be the dot value of that. So whatever the value that people put into that ID of that box is what we're going to use. So your name is now going to be holding whatever someone puts in. So if someone puts in Steve, your name is going to be Steve. If someone puts in Rich, your name is going to be Rich. If someone puts in Jane, your name is going to be Jane. So that's the first part. So we're just storing that. We're not doing anything with it yet. So what are we going to do with it? So now that we got that, we got whatever name someone puts in, what are we going to do with it? What we are going to do is we're going to display it in this area. There's a little area for it to display, and that area is going to be under my choice, and it's called my title. It has an ID. It's a paragraph. It's called, so we're going to replace where it says human, we're going to change it to be my title. So we're going to put that in here, and again, we're not using the if yet, so we're going to have to use the if, but the way we do that in here, we'll use that shortcut again, that function expression. We're going to put in parentheses, and we'll just put it in quotes, and I'll put my title, and that just is a shortcut. That just means this. That's all that means. It's just a shortcut for that. So this $ represents document.getElementByID. So we're just kind of, this $ is just using that. So it's just less typing. And what we're going to say is my title, and we're basically going to set it so it displays that. So how do we display that again? Well, we display using .inner HTML. So we're going to use .inner HTML. At least that's one of the ways, and that's the way we've been using it. So we're going to say in the ID, my title, inner HTML is now going to equal, and it's going to equal your name. It's going to equal your name. So we're going to just pass that variable along. So the value that they type in is now going to display in there. That's what's going to happen when they generate this function. And how is that function generated? Well, it's actually has to be generated by this button that's up here. Here's the submit button, and we're just going to put in here, we could do it right inside the button. We're going to do onClick equals, and then in quotes, we're going to put the function name, which is submitName. And we need the parentheses in there. So onClick equals submitName. I'm going to save what I have so far. Now, we didn't do the if else because what we did not do, we declared a variable of your name and just set it to nothing to start. And we now created a function called submitName so that it basically gets the value that someone puts into that field and displays it. Now let's just try it out and see what happens. And I'm just going to put in my name, and I should refresh this, and I'll put in my name and I'll hit submit name, and it did it. Okay, that's good. Now here's something, I'll refresh this. What if you don't? It has a problem. It doesn't put anything in there because we have a value right now of nothing, so it puts nothing in there and it wipes it out and it kind of screws it up. So it now puts nothing in there and it gets bumped up. So we have to make sure that if somebody doesn't put anything in there, that it still works. So that's where we're going to use an if-else statement. So I'm going to go back here, and we have part of this done already. We could basically say if somebody puts nothing in, it'll stay human. The name will stay human in here. So I'm actually going to wait and I'm going to put this if after people fill this in, because the first thing on the function is if they put in a name and it's nothing, then what happens? So I'm going to leave this first before I do the if. So I'm going to do if, and then the way if statements work is they basically put a parentheses and you put a condition in there. So our condition in this if statement is going to be if your name, when we use the regular equal sign, that just means you're assigning something. If you're testing equivalency or equality between the two, we use two equal signs. So we're going to say if your name equals blank, or an empty string, then what's going to happen? And I'll just tab this in here, and it actually uses brackets. So this is going to have to, we're going to have to put a bracket behind here. So there's a bracket for the if, and then there's going to be a pair of brackets for the else, and they're all going to be inside these opening and closing brackets. So inside the function brackets, there's going to be brackets for if and brackets for else. If has a condition, else does not. The if condition is if your name is blank, then my title, and we're going to have to change this here because we want it to say human. So I'm going to say human here, and it's actually a string, it's not a variable, so I have to put quotes around it because I have no variable called human. So we're basically going to say, okay, when you hit the button, we're going to get the value. First thing we're going to do in the function is just get the value and pass it in a variable called your name. So whatever the value is. So we're going to pass that in, and we're going to say, well, whatever that is, if it's nothing, then just leave it human. If it's not, which the not part is the else will have no condition, so we don't need anything in parentheses. We'll just have another bracket, curly bracket afterwards for the else. So, you know, this is the pair for the if, this is the pair for the else. And what's going to happen? I'll just copy this, and we had this actually the one we wrote the first time. And the else is basically going to be get the element of my title, and in the inner HTML put in your name. And we already did that, so we know it works, and we don't need anything around it. We don't want quotes because it's not a string. We don't need plus signs because we're not concatenating it with anything. So this is basically our if and else. So again, the submit name function basically is going to get a value from whatever someone puts in the input text field, and then before it does anything else, it's going to say, well, if it's nothing, then just leave it so it displays human. If it's anything else, Steve, Bob, any other name, then display your name, because we're already holding it in there. So we're getting it first, and then we're displaying it here. If not, you know, you could do these different ways, but we're basically doing it so if they do nothing, it displays human. Then otherwise, it'll display whatever name someone has. Keep in mind that all of these brackets here, there's 6 brackets. There's 2 brackets for the opening function and closing function. Then there's 2 brackets for the if and 2 brackets for the else. Else does not have a condition. If does have a condition, and we use 2 equals to indicate if we're testing equality. So I'll save that, and we'll see if it works. We'll go here, and I'll just refresh it, and I'll hit submit name, and it just stays human because that's what it was. And I'll put in my name. This time I'll say, okay, I don't want to just be human. I'll put in my name. And now it changes that to Rich because that's the ID that's called my title. And then because we declared that variable outside of the function, we could use it in other places because we may want to use the name again at the end and say, congratulations, Rich, or whatever name you put in there. So that's the first part. That's our first function. We have a lot of functions to do in here, a lot of IDs to identify and a lot of things to display, but that's just our first part. So that's just a little warm up for our JavaScript for the first part. So that's just taking the name, that's just taking the initial name in the input box and submitting it, and using that so it's a little more personal. It's Rich against the computer or you against the computer instead of just human versus computer. So you know that that's you. Now we have nothing working here yet. Nothing else is working. So that's what we're going to do next. So we'll stop here. That was just the first part. And that was just basically doing this submit name function and just kind of loosening up. And we also did a function expression, this var with the $sign, and we're going to use that throughout the rest of our JavaScript. So we'll move on to part 4, which will be more of our JavaScript.